Hello and welcome back. We are working on lesson 3.03 in the color theory acrylic painting unit. Today's lesson, we're going to be talking about painting secondary and complementary colors. So let's review what secondary colors are first. So the three examples of secondary colors are orange, violet, and green. And my question to you would be, how do you make those secondary colors? So how would you make orange? The official definition of secondary colors tells us that secondary colors are colors from which are made from mixing two primary colors. So how do you make orange? Well, you mix red and yellow to make orange. If we're looking at the color wheel here at the top of the screen, you can see that red is here. I'm sorry, red is here and yellow is here. And if we move two spaces from yellow and two spaces from red, we end up with orange. So the color wheel is just that chart we talked about in the previous lesson. So we're going to use our two primary colors today to mix our secondary colors. And we'll do this process 3 times. On top of understanding secondary colors, we also need to understand complementary colors for today's lesson. Complementary colors are the examples red and green are complementary colors. They look good together. They complement each other. Blue and orange and yellow and purple. Think of sports teams or a holiday where we use these colors together. The idea is each of these colors makes the other color pop, and so they look good together. And when we think about how they're constructed and made, we've got red and then you have green. Green is made from yellow and blue. So when you have these colors present, you really have all color present, which is another reason that they pop. So the official definition of complementary colors are two colors from which are directly opposite from each other on the color wheel. So as we're looking at this color wheel here at the top of our screen, or in the middle of your screen, you can see that purple or violet is at the bottom and straight across from that is yellow. That's how we can use the chart to identify complementary colors. And when we're looking at green, straight across from green is red, and orange and straight across from orange is blue. So it makes sense that they're directly opposite on the color wheel. Easy to identify. You can do this with more complex colors as well. This color here is an example of a yellow green, and the yellow green is across from our red violet. So yellow green and red violet are also complementary colors. All right, now that we have an understanding of secondary colors and complementary colors, let's jump back to our first step, which is painting some of those secondary colors. So I'm going to switch over to my camera screen. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to look at this again. This is our example of our color wheel. We have our primary and our primary right here is a secondary. So we'll start with this one here today. So we're going to mix red and yellow. So I'm going to open up my paint palette. And you can see that I have my paint from the previous day and I have some other mixing that I've already done. So we'll just go over here on this one. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to start mixing our red and our yellow. So I'm going to grab our red and our yellow. Now, when you mix acrylic paints, it's really important to start with your lighter color and add your darker color to it. So in this case, we're going to start with yellow. And I'm going to put a spot of yellow here on my paint palette. Again, about the size of a pea. And then what we're going to do is we're going to try to put equal amount of this red. Now, knowing that secondary colors are made by equal parts, we also have to understand that acrylic paints, the darker color will overwhelm. So I am going to go a slight less amount, just a little less of my red. And I can always add more, but I can't put it back in the tube and I can't take it away from what I've mixed. So I'm going to start with that. Okay, now it's time to mix. We could take our brush and we could use the bristles and we could mix. But yesterday or in our previous session, I told you that we never get paint up into the metal part. So the bristles, we always want to keep our paint in the lower half of our bristles. That being said, I would make a mess if I tried to mix this with my bristles. So I'm going to flip my brush around and I'm going to use the end of the brush. I'm going to take this and I'm going to swirl or mix those two colors together with the end of my brush. And as I do that, it's kind of like magic. And I'm starting to get a really nice orange color. And I do really like it. I think it's going to work out well for the project. You might mix it and you might say, oh my goodness, it's too dark or it's too light. In this case, I'm happy. So I'm going to take the end of my brush and my paper towel and I'm just going to wipe that off, cleaning off the end of my brush. Okay. We want to make sure we're cleaning up as we go. If we make a mess, because that mess will just get bigger and bigger if we don't clean up. If I needed to add more to this, knowing that we always add our light color to our dark, if I had to add more yellow, I would do it off to the side and I would bring that darker color into it. If I had to add my red, if I needed to be more red, I would add just a very little bit directly to it because the darker can go into lighter. But you always add paint. Start with your light and add your dark. All right, now that I have my color mixed and I'm happy with it, I'm going to come up here to my secondary rectangle. And I'm going to load my brush, a little bit of paint on the front, a little bit of paint on the back there. And I'm going to start just like I did yesterday in our previous session. And I'm going to go ahead and go around the edges neatly, always pulling my brush so that I'm never pushing those bristles and I don't have control and I'll ruin the brush. So I'm going to switch directions with my hand. I'll go around this edge up here and down this side. If I need to, if it starts to pool, I'll just grab some more paint on my brush. And I'm going to switch directions. I'm going to come from the top so that I'm starting at the edge and pulling those bristles. I'm always pulling. And then after I have that kind of laid or blocked in, I can come back and add some more paint and fill in that area. And I didn't talk about this yesterday, but most of the time when I'm painting, I will paint holding my brush like I would hold my pencil. Sometimes you will see me flip my hand over and I'll hold it more like this as I'm trying to get control or change directions. Most of the time it's going to be more like a pencil. All right, I'm happy with my orange up there. So that's going to be our secondary orange. But I want to go back to that color wheel for just a minute because we're going to talk about our triangles at the bottom of our page. And the idea is the triangles represent our complementary colors. So if we're painting orange, we need to remember that straight across is blue. So when we look at our worksheet, when we come down to the bottom, we are going to paint our orange across from the blue. So right down here, I'm going to grab a little bit of orange and I'm going to paint in this complementary color pair. Notice how they're pointing at each other. That's by design. That's to help us remember that when they are on the color wheel, they do just that. They point at each other. And now I have my orange triangle. If you need to, if your colors don't seem like they are being very opaque or solid, you can always let them dry a bit and go back and paint a second coat if you need to. All right, so that is our orange in both places. So now we're ready to move on to the next color. So between colors, we're going to take our water cup and we're going to wash out our brush really well. So I'm going to put my brush in my water, push it against the bottom, clean that off really well, and then I will dry off my brush on my paper towel. Okay. Next color that we're going to do is down here. So if we're thinking about how to make this secondary color, we're going to use the two primary colors on either side of it. We know that secondary colors are made by two primaries. So we're going to do yellow and blue. With yellow and blue, we are going to look at this. Here, this might actually be better. We're going to look at this. This yellow is our lighter color, so we're going to start with that. And I'm going to put that down. Blue is significantly darker than yellow. So I need very, very little blue. Even though primary secondary colors are made by equal parts. We're going to start with just a very little bit of blue because it is very dark and acrylic paint works a little differently. So we're going to mix our yellow and our blue, and we are getting a nice green. If that green tends to be a little dark, that means maybe you used a little too much blue. You can always add some yellow, but you want to do that on the side. Don't, and I'm washing off the back of my brush on my paper towels. You don't want to add it right in there. I'm not going to squeeze that yellow in. I'm going to squeeze it off to the side, and I'm going to mix the green into that yellow. We always mix, start with our lighter color and add our darker to it. You'll hear me say that a lot. All right, so I've got my green. I'm going to load my brush up with my green, and I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to paint my secondary color green around my edges. Remember I said in the previous session, I said, ooh, edges. They communicate a lot to our viewer. It's super important when we're painting. I can't paint up to the edge of the back of the brush there. I don't have control. I have to switch directions to get a nice crisp, sharp edge on that. I can't paint with the back edge of the brush. I'm going to use the top tip bristles to guide and be the front runner, essentially, of all my brush strokes. All right, I'm going to just fill this in with my green. Again, if it looks a little thin, mine's looking a little thin in some areas, I can let this dry, and I can always come back and add to it. All right, nicely done there. Now, when we're thinking about our secondary complementary color, once again, let's go back. We're looking at green. Straight across from green on the color wheel is red. So we want to make sure that we're positioning our green triangle underneath or pointing at our red triangle. So it's going to go right here at the bottom of our page. And again, I'm working on those edges, trying to keep those nice and crisp and sharp. Like so on the project. Here we go. All right, we're down to our last secondary color. So I'm going to rinse out my green in my water cup. Get rid of that. Dry off my brush in my paper towel over here. Keep it clean. And then we're going to go ahead and talk about the last one. Now, this last one, I saved it for the last because I do struggle more with this than the other colors. But we are going to take the two primary colors, red and blue. We're going to bring those two colors together to make a secondary color here. So think right now, what do you think is going to happen when I mix red and blue together? What secondary color am I going to make? We're going to come over here. They're both dark colors. Blue is darker, so I'm going to start with red. So we'll put some red down. And I'm going to start again with just a little bit of blue. Not quite as much since it's my darker color. And sealing up these paints when I'm not using them so they don't dry out. Use the back end of my paintbrush, and I'm going to mix my red and blue together and make a nice, what do we think it's going to be? If you guessed purple or violet, you are correct. So red and blue makes our secondary purple. And clean off the back of that brush. I'm going to use my paper towel. Get rid of that, make sure it's nice and clean. And then I'm going to go ahead and start painting in my purple. So I'll load up my brush. I'm going to come up here to my secondary space between red and blue. And it almost looks black on the camera, like as we're looking here in the paint palette. It does look very, very dark. But as we get it down on the paper, it definitely looks more purple. And I'm going to just paint those edges all the way around. Like so. Get this side here. Let's bottom edge. Always pulling those bristles, never, ever, 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 ever pushing them. And I'm just going to fill in that whole rectangle. Okay, so there is that space. And again, it looks really dark on camera and really dark. It's really pretty nice. It's a pretty nice purple. Okay, after I do that, I'm going to come down here, and the only complement left is my yellow. And yellow and violet, or yellow and purple, do complement each other. So I'm going to come down here, and I'm going to paint in that last triangle space that we have here. Okay. So at this point, I have my primaries and my secondaries all painted on our color wheel worksheet paper. So I'm going to go ahead and clean up by, again, washing my brush off in my water cup, dry it off with my paper towel. Before our next session, since I'm done painting for the day, I'm going to go ahead and take my paintbrush up to my sink, and I will wash out my brush appropriately with soap and make sure that water runs clean so that this brush will last a really very long time. I'm going to dump out my water. I'm going to take my paint palette. I'll turn it over, seal that up nice and tight so that stays sealed and doesn't dry out for us before our next session. At this point, we're done with the step for today, so make sure that you're taking a photograph of this and adding it to our sketchbook, our progress sketchbook. If you have any concerns or questions about your secondary colors, mixing those colors, or the placement of them on the color wheel, please reach out and let me know. Otherwise, enjoy the process.